afternoon, and thank you, Tom, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. Special thanks to the organizers of this conference. I've been very enthusiastic about this subject, which I think is so important and timely given what's happening in the world. You know, what we're trying to do here is to bring some evidence-based policy research to a defense and security audience like this. So this is a great opportunity. But first I want to set a little bit of context for the report. You know, we're living in a pretty troubled times right now. We have basic appreciation among established democracies for the positive contribution that democracy and human rights play in their national security strategies. Basically, societies that are governed with respect for liberal democratic principles and universal human rights are safer, they're stronger, and they're more secure. But current geopolitical and domestic political dynamics are challenging these assumptions. We just had the last panel talking about the United States and Trump's nationalist America First approach of zero-sum competition. China asserting one-party capitalism as a model for developing countries. Russia exploiting openness of democratic systems to undermine them. We have rising democracies. I've done a lot of research looking at India and Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, countries that are very proud of their democratic progress and economic progress, but are ambivalent about this democratic peace theory, are insecure about their own commitment to it, and preoccupied with their own concerns at home, which leaves Europe and Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand as the remaining stalwarts of this international liberal order, but obviously shaky with internal problems themselves. The question we're trying to put on the table here is, are values and interests two separate things that are always in competition with one another? Because when they are in competition with one another, values usually lose. And this seems to undermine, over time, our core values of who we are and what we stand for. And that has its own effect that can be quite negative. Putting aside the values argument, however, we did want to look at the instrumental argument for why democracy and human rights are important for national security. And the empirical evidence is quite strong for that argument, and I will walk you through some of the particulars. And the bottom line conclusion is that national security strategies should give a much greater priority to strengthening liberal democracy in targeted and flexible ways, and of course, learn the lessons from previous mistakes, Iraq and Libya, to name just two recent examples. I won't go into this slide too much on the methodology, but just to mention that working closely with Minister Mehdi Joma and Secretary Albright and our partners in Africa, we did a series of studies and reports and papers. They're all available on the Brookings Institution website with links on the Community of Democracies website. And we focus not just on the traditional questions of, do democracies go to war with one another? The evidence is quite clear that they do not. But we focus rather on some of the transnational challenges that Thomas Greminger talked about this morning, terrorism and cybersecurity, as well as issues of civil war, which, as we know, have increased over the last decade, violent crime, human security, and gender violence. So turning to internal armed conflicts, the evidence is quite clear that countries with strong records of respect for democracy and human rights are far less likely to experience civil wars than what we call hybrid regimes, regimes that are a mixture of authoritarian and democratic practices. These are countries that, if you look at their rankings and surveys and studies that have been done, may be in different places on the path either toward democracy or away from democracy, but this is turning out to be a highly unstable situation to be in. And this graph is a very simple depiction of what that looks like. Democracies on the far right experiencing less conflict, but so do autocracies. they also avoid civil war, but they do it very differently. They do it through repression and co-optation of their populations. Hybrid regimes are greater risk because they're not yet committed, the elites, to sharing power, and they have a lower state capacity and fewer resources to secure peace. You also often see state capture by predatory elites and a very weak social contract, which leads to competition, conflict, other problems like forced migration. So how do we address this particular problem? The democracies together, donors and others, need to really prioritize support to these countries that are on a path towards democracy, but are not there yet. And much more work needs to be done to widen the political participation, tackle corruption, support rule of law, and I would say, for this audience in particular, reform the security sector, which includes civilian control of the military, greater parliamentary oversight, dealing with abuses through either the military justice system or otherwise. Turning now very quickly to terrorism and violent extremism, we come to a similar conclusion where you would think strong open democracies are actually more vulnerable to attack, but countries with good respect for civil liberties, do not practice torture, and honor the rule of law are much less likely to experience domestic or transnational terrorist violence than other types of regimes. And if you look at this next chart, here are the top 10 deadliest attacks in 2016. These countries are not democracies. And it's not surprising to see that result. Now, there is an exception in the literature that shows that established democracies that are engaged in the war on terrorism do have a higher risk of transnational terrorist attacks, with higher numbers of foreign fighters and lone wolves that are inspired by the transnational groups. Now, looking at the root causes of what is driving the rise in terrorism, it's obviously very complex. But new surveys show, surveys of former fighters, that the grievances around exclusion from politics, exclusion from the economic benefits of society, or experience firsthand with either state agents of corruption or violence are key factors for radicalization. These are trigger points. So we have to think harder as democracies in not overreacting when there is an attack and dealing with it through the rule of law and not warfare. We have to, of course, when there are abuses committed by state agents, they need to be held accountable. And also the importance of designing customized local strategies, bottom up, that include women and youth and religious leaders. On violent crime, we looked closely at murder rates in particular, which has the best data sets around the world. And you see, again, strong democracies and strong autocracies have lower rates of homicides, but they're higher in these mixed regimes that don't yet have a settled way of dealing with these problems and have lower state capacity. But in the crime area, you also see lots of other factors. It's a heterogeneous problem set. You have correlations with high inequality or high divorce rates, also contributing to higher crime rates. Or if you look in the case of Latin America, high rates of impunity, which has something to do with the higher violence there. So it's important that democracies focus on aligning their criminal justice systems with human rights and really focus on the high-risk places where crime is most prevalent with a variety of deterrence strategies, not just the use of police. We also wanted to look at human security and freedom from want because there are obvious correlations between places where failed states with very high poverty and conflict. And what you see in the evidence is actually a weak correlation between democracy and human security. Democracies don't necessarily do a better job at delivering better outcomes. But when you combine inclusive systems with strong meritocratic, bureaucratic states, then you get a much better result and higher correlation. So democracies need to have strong participatory mechanisms, but also strong institutions to deal with this, and investing as donors in democracies, investing heavily in state capacity. Gender equality and violence, there's a growing body of literature that shows that societies that treat women equally, both politically and economically, and societies that have lower levels of violence against women are much more peaceful. They're much more peaceful at home, and they're much more peaceful in terms of their foreign policies. And that is a basic lesson that I think policymakers are just now beginning to take to heart. And we do have various international instruments, including the Security Council resolution and Sustainable Development Goal 5, which addresses this issue. And the remedy is quite clear. Much greater effort to expand women's political participation, mainstream gender issues in the security sector, in the judiciary, and give women a much greater role in conflict prevention, in mediation of conflicts, and after conflicts in the stabilization process. And there's a slide here that just graphically demonstrates the connection between physical security for women and democracy. Finally, on cybersecurity, now we don't have enough experience yet looking at the relationship between strong democracies and cybersecurity, but we all know from the recent past that the revolution in digital communications has exposed more open societies to the dangers of weaponization, criminality, the role that corporations are playing in amassing big data on our personal lives, and then the way states are able to use that data to surveil their own populations. And as we've seen in the United States and elsewhere in Europe, electoral processes are particularly vulnerable to this problem, and the right to privacy, I would say, is under tremendous stress. So democracies right now have a very important role. I would argue that we need to design some kind of rule-based system to protect a neutral and stable internet. But right now, the conditions are very bad. You have a lot of fragmentation geopolitically. Businesses, of course, don't want this kind of regulation, and you have more and more walls going up, a balkanization of the internet that will make, I think, globalization slow down and threaten our rights. So the internet needs to be treated as a global public good, and we need to establish some common ground rules. We would suggest that democracies need to lead in this effort. Otherwise, we're going to end up with the lowest common denominator, which is not going to be very favorable to democracies. And a code of conduct of non-interference in each other's elections, including political financing, might be a good place to start. Finally, just to summarize, liberal democracies are safer. They need to lead by example. We heard a lot about this effort to distinguish Trump's rhetoric from his actions, which I've heard repeatedly since I've been in Europe the last month, which I think just doesn't fly personally, but that's an editorial comment on my part. We need to really prioritize fragile states and get them out of that dangerous gray zone of the hybrid regimes. So a lot more work, a lot more resources need to go into support for democracy if we want a safer world to live in. And it's got to be done not just in the democracy promotion business, but it's got to be mainstreamed and integrated into our national security strategies. So our defense ministries have their own role to play in working with their counterparts on supporting civilian management of the defense sector, having greater transparency around what our militaries do, and then holding them accountable when abuses take place. Women and youth, of course, have an important role to play. China and Russia are going to have to be challenged on these issues. And the question is, can the transatlantic coalition still lead, given what we have on both sides of the pond these days. So that's my quick overview, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ted, and we'll be hearing from Ted again at the conclusion of this session. Could I ask the members of the panel to please come up to the stage, and I'll introduce them. And so we are joined by Mr. Mehdi Joma, who was Prime Minister of Tunisia from 2014 to 2015. Next to him is Miriam Lexman, who is the EU Regional Program Director of the International Republican Institute. Nicolas Tinzer is President of the Center for Study and Analysis for Political Reform in Paris. And we also have Christopher Walker, who is Vice President for Studies and Analysis at the National Endowment for Democracy. We're going to have questions for the members of the panel, and then we'll open it up to you. So actually, let me just begin with you, Prime Minister Joma. I want to thank you again for the key role you played with Secretary Albright in shaping this report. The data that Ted just presented pointed to the important role of women in peace and security. Do you have any comments on this, I think, sometimes overlooked factor of security?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Ted, for the presentation. It's a good feedback from the work, the hard work that you made with your team, and it was interesting. In fact, we consider that women is at the heart. It's one of the major stakeholders in the democracy, and we have, maybe I will speak about Tunisia. We have a special and important experience in Tunisia. In Tunisia, in the 15th, just after the independence, there was big work done on what we call the personal code to give the woman the same rights and to be as equal as possible, at least beginning with the law. And we saw when we got trouble after and we got the security threatens, the woman was really the dam of that. I remember in 2013, where there was a big fight between seculars and Islamists, and the society model was threatened. The real dam was the woman. So it's important today. The guarantee of the path, in the path of the security, on the path of the democracy, and is the woman in Tunisia. 2/3 of the students are women today. They are the majority in some sectors like doctors, professors, in the justice. And I think we have to empower one of the issues that we have to check, and one of the paths of the improvement that we have to ensure today, which is an important challenge for our society, is how to empower economically the women. You know, it's not only in Tunisia, but everywhere we have this real problem. And the experience that each time we have this economic empowerment of the women, we see the investment and the impact on the social stability. Now we are checking all the codes we have, and a couple of months we voted a new law against violence, and in the violence it's not only physical violence, economic violence. So for us, it's important, really, if we want to go ahead in the path, in the direction of more democracy, and to protect the society against violence, extremism, and terrorism. I think the best investment that we have to do is in the woman and maybe in our region.
Thank you very much. Miriam, a key finding in the report is that consolidated democracies are strong in the face of violent extremism. But as Ted was noting, hybrid or young democracies are much more vulnerable. I know that a recent poll done by your organization in Kosovo found that weak democratic institutions contributed to these vulnerabilities. Could you maybe share with the audience some of the things you, your organization, have learned along this line?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tom. Yes, it's true that our polls are finding a kind of correlation between the vulnerabilities of democracies in terms of young democracies vis-à-vis extremism and violence, and on the other hand, strong democracies are more resistant to some impact of international crime, violence. But on the other hand, maybe I will reverse this question and also answer some of the thoughts, which came to my mind when Mr. Piccone was presenting the results. I was struck when you said that in the conflict or in the decision between values and interests, that interests win. But I was just wondering if there is a way how we can make values in the center of our interests, because what kind of values they are if they are not in the center of our interests. And I will maybe bring a couple of ideas about this, because it's true that in kind of larger scale we see strong democracies much more resistant to violence, extremism, and weak and new democracies more vulnerable. But when we look at the EU, I think there are a couple of other aspects which come up. First of all, when we talk about hybrid conflicts, I believe that there are some vulnerabilities which we can see across countries, regardless how strong the democracy is and how old the democracy is. And these hybrid conflicts are actually exploiting the weak points and weak parts of our democracies. And those are, I would say, in many democracies, older and young ones, similar, which is, for example, media and the quality of media, where we see, for example, and there is another opinion poll which we did in the V4 countries, and in Germany we were looking in the way how disinformation is actually making or being used by internal, external powers in terms of gaps in the democracies of the societies. And one big difference we saw between Germany and the V4 countries was actually the trust in mainstream media. In Germany, the trust in mainstream media is much more stronger, and thus the society is much more resistant to the disinformation efforts to disturb our democracy. And contrary to that, in the V4 countries, we see that the lack of trust in mainstream media actually pushes people directly into the arms of disinformation and many fringe media which are providing, or which are hybridly providing different ways of, or trying to manipulate sentimentally or providing disinformation. That's one aspect. Another aspect is, of course, the kind of global shield the big democracies are providing to the young democracies. So that's why, we can see more attacks in the western part of the EU, but obviously this is a geopolitical structure where the young democracies are small countries, do not play such a strong role geopolitically, so are practically saved by the shield of the older democracies and big states in the EU, which I think it's not always taken into consideration by the smaller states. So maybe about the vulnerabilities of democracies as such is first of what I mentioned already is the quality of media and the role of social media, which now we need to look into the, I think also psychological aspects behind the social media, how it works and how it makes our societies vulnerable, or what kind of vulnerabilities are being exploited by social media. And second thing I would like to mention is civil society, because the strength of the institutions, the democratic institutions, is one thing, but I think we need to fill in these institutions by kind of vibrant, genuine civil society. And I don't mean only NGOs, I mean communities, small groups, parents in schools who are observing what is happening with their children. And here I would also mention mothers, because we mentioned the role of women, and I think what is absolutely vital is to support the role of mothers for upbringing their children, because this is also, especially in modern societies when women have to combine work and family, I think this is something we need to think about, how to provide a safer space for the children, because this world is providing lots of dangers, and I think that's in the family. This is where the children, while growing into adults and citizens need to be protected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nicholas, one of the things also the report was noting was the importance of democracies leading by example in countering violence, violent extremism. Could you tell us what kind of democratic strategies you see that are appropriate for countering terrorism? And also, could you maybe outline long-term security policies that are based on core democratic values?
Well, certainly. Thank you, Christopher. Well, I think we have 3 points. I think that the first thing that we have to consider is that the crackdown on human rights, crackdown on rule of law, crackdown on democratic values offer good predictions for aggression abroad. And it means that we must have early warning and also early action. Just take an example. Myself and many others were considering, for instance, in what happened in Chechnya. And I think that what happened in Chechnya was really predictive on what happened after in Georgia, in Ukraine, and in Syria. It means that from this point of view, we must not turn a blind eye to what happens in some countries when you have either civil war forged by the central power, like in Russia, or the crackdown on human rights, could be also gay rights, and all the human rights and democratic values, and of course the attacks on dissidents, on human rights fighters, that happened in some countries, not only in Russia. It's not our interest, because the report, and Ted was talking about interest, and I think that's part of our national interest, security interest, and we have to talk about that. That's the first point, and that's all about security strategies in the long run. That was your questions. The second thing that I want to emphasize is that we have, of course, to debunk myths, and this myth is the myth of the so-called stable regimes. I think that the idea of what we call stabilocracy is basically a wrong idea, because up to what point so-called stable regimes are really stable? Let's take some example. Let's take Egypt, for instance. Some people in 2010 were saying, well, no problem with Mubarak, or no problem with Ben Ali. You have stable regimes, and that's a good protections against terrorism, against radical Islam, against etc. It's completely untrue. All the factors were there in Egypt, in Tunisia, in some other countries for revolution and for instability. And if we consider Egyptian regime right now, what happened in Egypt? You have not only the crackdown on human rights, you don't have only a lot of prisoners, also from the liberal side of the political spectrum, not only Muslim Brotherhood, but also, that's also a question, because you have also many brothers who are actually turning even more radical, in Sisi's prisons in Egypt. But up to what point this regime is stable? It's not stable, because if we are considering the situation of the policy forces and the army forces there, they are not efficient at all, because very often those kind of so-called stable regimes goes hand in hand with corruption and efficiency and these sort of things. So the question is, which is a real wrong idea, which is the idea of some democracy, okay, we dislike those regimes, but we have to support them. Completely untrue, because then you have a growing resentment amongst the people. Just look at what happened in Syria, which is the worst, I think, the worst tragedy of the 21st century. 500,000 people died in Syria, mostly because of Assad, not because of ISIS. Not saying because ISIS is not, of course, barbarity, of course it is. But just see what happened with 12 million people displaced. What will be the future of the Middle East regions if we consider what happened in Syria? Not only resentment, diseducations, and that will be easy prey for those children, easy prey for radical Muslims, of course, also. And we are just preparing, actually in Syria, the terrorism of the next coming years. That's my second point. And then my third point is basically about liberal values from 3 points of view. First of all, we cannot advocate at home illiberal values. We cannot go into the crackdown on the judiciary, independence of the judiciary. We cannot, well, attack gay rights and this sort of thing, and then pretend to counter Russia's narratives, for instance. Because we must be liberal at home if we want to have the legitimacy to fight against illiberalism abroad. There must be a discourse that is consistent with our values. Because security is not only military security, it's all about the values, about the narrative, about the legitimacy. And that's quite important. The second thing, and especially for Europe, is that we have to engage into much more assistance to democracy and human rights abroad. That's, I think, the role of Europe. My own president, Emmanuel Macron, had a wonderful speech at the United Nations General Assembly recently on human rights. He was right. But no, this discourse, this speech, must be consistent with the daily actions of France and Europe. There must be no complacency for those kinds of regime. Then, and that may be my last point, we have also to understand who our foes are. We have enemies. There is what in German we call a Kulturkampf. It's a fight about values. And sometimes we are talking, for instance, about the military threat coming from Russia. And of course, it's a real danger both in Central and Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. But you have also a fight coming from Russia for illiberal values. And we have to understand that at the end of the day, the aim of Russia is to dismantle the world order, to undermine the international law and humanitarian laws, and to delegitimize our fight for democracy. So that's why we have also to reappropriate the discourse which is consistent to our values. And that's something which is all about education, that's all about Europe's security, that's all about Europe values. And that's why I was talking about consistency, because if we are not consistent, then we will lose the fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now a question to Chris Walker of the National Endowment for Democracy. Chris, how do we adapt the democratic peace argument referred to by Ted to today's circumstances? People have referred to cyber warfare. How do we adapt the democratic peace argument to circumstances in which non-military, non-kinetic forms of warfare seem to be on the rise?
Well, thanks, Tom. And I want to commend you and Ted for a terrific report. I agree with the findings in it, and maybe I'll just take a moment to maybe build on some of that relating to your question. It also builds on something that Nicholas said, which is this question of whether values and interests come into conflict. I think it's more important now than 10 years ago or ever to remind ourselves that values animate interests, and interests animate values. And I'll put it in this context. I think if we were here 12 or 15 years ago having a conversation of this sort, we wouldn't have had any sort of conception of the way in which countries like Russia, but not only Russia, China, and other very powerful authoritarian regimes were able to retool their resources and mobilize their resources, not first and foremost in military ways, so not in the ways that often the democratic peace theory is thought of, at least on the surface, but they really put their emphasis on what I would argue are the softer dimensions of this. But I say that in quotes because what we're seeing now, both in young and more established democracies, are attacks on the prestige integrity and legitimacy of democracies, which is really undermining our own security. And so in this respect, I think in today's context, you see an even clearer link between democracy and security. And so the United States, established democracies in the long-standing democracies of the European Union, have to grapple with questions that really weren't in the forefront of anyone's minds as recently as a decade ago. And so I think in this respect, reestablishing, reinvigorating our own democratic conviction and values is essential for our security. How do we know this? We know this, and if we use the Russia example, because the Russian regime aims at our democracy, first and foremost. It's true that they've used cyber warfare in Estonia. They've used military force in Georgia. They've used information warfare and intimidation and the threat of force in Crimea. They've used information warfare and kinetic warfare in eastern Ukraine. But beyond that, and of course Syria, so it's a very active program they've had in the last decade by just about any measure. Beyond that, it's largely non-kinetic. It's the use of cyber instruments, message manipulation of online platforms, and the communication of certain ideas. And I think this is what I would stress. It's both a mobilization of what I would call anti-democratic infrastructure, but also ideas, and they're related. So we know about the most visible parts of the Russian and Chinese information infrastructure. This is things like RT and Sputnik and CGTN and Xinhua and so forth. But there's an enormous amount of activity through surrogates, adherents, and other supporters that are operating within the democracies and elsewhere that are carrying certain messages. And I think here too we underestimated the impact that these ideas and messages could exert within the democracies. And we don't have to go into great detail. I think people in the audience are familiar with this, but these messages and ideas tend to be quite tailored to different circumstances. They tend to be applied in different degrees of intensity in certain areas. They can be calibrated in certain ways. This is something that the Baltic states, for example, have experienced for many, many years and know as well as anyone. And I think one of the other things I would stress is that the Baltic states, the countries in Central Europe, the Visegrad countries, have learned a lot over the years about these sorts of challenges, and they can teach the established democracies something about defending the integrity and security of the established democracies' systems. And this is something we need to take into account in greater measure in Western Europe and North America. So I just conclude by saying that I think all of the issues we've discussed in what I would call the common understanding of the democracy-security relationship, certainly in the post-Cold War era, they all still hold. But I would argue we need to take that one step forward precisely because our own security is being attacked by virtue of targeting of our democratic system and values.
Thank you. Very excellent point. And thank you to the entire panel for this very broad overview of the question of democracy and security. We'd like to turn this to the audience now to see if you have any comments, questions for someone. We have, I don't know if we have microphones, but if you would like to just... We can probably hear you if you... That's right. Okay. That's fine. All right. We'll take, let's see, this gentleman, and then we'll take your question also.
Dennis Kolesnik, Paris-based independent analyst. And I have a small question to Mr. Joma. Recently, you've, I mean, not your government, but government of Tunisia adopted legislation allowing Tunisian women to marry non-Muslim men. It is something that basically can be understood as a revolution within the Arab world and Muslim world. And I know that your country has been criticized by your neighbors, mainly Algeria and Morocco, for this legislation. Maybe not so openly, but mostly unofficially. And Tunisia now is an exemplary country in the Maghreb region. But my question is, I understand that you're not responsible for the actions of the current government, but do you believe that your country will stay on this road, will continue to undertake liberal reforms, or maybe something may happen in the middle of the way? And will actually the liberal reforms in Tunisia affect your relations with Algeria and Morocco? Thank you.
Thank you. And would you hand the microphone to the woman in the next? There we go. Let's see, we keep bypassing this one individual. Go ahead.
Shall I go with the
Go ahead,
question?
please.
Okay.
Yes.
My name is Barçın İnanç. I'm a journalist from Turkey. When it comes to values and security, I guess Turkey is a country in line, and I see a lot of confusion on the part of European countries on how to treat Turkey, especially since democratic deficit has taken a big speed. But let me just open a parenthesis and express my appreciation for Mr. Tenzer on his especially views on Egypt, because looking from Turkey, sometimes we see a lot of criticism on Turkey. Erdogan, Erdogan, Erdogan all the time. It's normal, obviously, because of the democratic backpedaling, but you don't see the similar things sometimes concerning Sisi, for instance. And sometimes that makes me think that because the Egyptian ruler stands as someone, stopping political Islam or political violence, but that comes at the expense of human rights violations, whereas the criticism on Erdogan comes too much because he poses as so-called as a Islamist leader, whereas there is a secular wing as well in the Turkish state. So let me just close the parentheses just to say that indeed sometimes it surprises us, this disproportionality of criticism in terms of human rights violations in certain countries. The question is to Mr. Tenzer, obviously, would be, as I said, I see a bit of confusion on the part of Europe on how to approach Turkey. I'd like to hear your voice, your views on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellency, would you like to speak first to the question on Tunisia, and then we'll go to Nicholas?
Okay, thank you. I would like to remind something. The changes does not occur today, since 2011. There was a fundamental change in the Tunisian society since the 1850s. You know that in Tunisia, the slavage was, the abolition of the slavage was in 1856. The first constitution as well was at that time. And you were speaking about the marriage with non-Muslim. In fact, it's not a new law. It's a part of the personal code that was voted in the 1950s, just after the independence. Just there was an administrative circular, how to say, like a note. It does not have the force of a law. It was simply cancelled, and so the changes in Tunisia are fundamental. They started since a couple of some generations. Now we are, l'avortement, how to say avortement? Abortion. Abortion was allowed before it was allowed in Europe. Elections. Women were allowed to elect, to be involved in the elections before some countries here in Europe. So now we are in the progress, and we have nice texts, we have nice laws since decades. Now we are progressing in the practicing them, which is the most important. You spoke about the country, the neighborhood. No, we don't have any problem with our neighbors. We have really good relationship. with Algeria, with Morocco, and we have a common strategy facing the security issues, but as well, with some difficulties, we want to converge in economy. And we have such respectful relationship that each country is adapts its laws with the nature of the society. So I can confirm that there is no issue with our neighbor countries and no interference.
Thank you. Nicholas?
Yes, thank you. Yes, about your question, madam, I think we obviously cannot have double standards. That's quite obvious. We cannot have different standards when it comes to Egypt, when it comes to Russia, when it comes to Turkey, when it comes to any other country. I think that the principle that we have to stand for are the same for any countries. Then, of course, when it comes to the diplomatic relationship with the negotiations, for the way to democracies to handle with undemocratic regimes, or where regimes where you have a crackdown on human rights, on the rule of law, etc. That's a different story, and I think we have to separate the two different things. But I think that the claim for democratic values, and very concretely, the assistance to democracy, to free media, or concern for political prisoners, and this sort of things, that's the same that we must have anywhere. Then I think that I have to point out another thing, which is, I think, very misleading, and which is still part of the Western narrative. And that's also, I think, part of my answer to your questions or to your remark. We must have, when it comes to human rights, have a sort of, I would say, culturalist approach. Some are saying that human rights, democratic principles are basically westernized principles, Western values. It's absolutely not the case. First of all, if we consider all those who are claiming for those rights, you have many people coming from not westernized societies, coming from Asian society, coming Confucian societies, coming from Islamic societies, etc. And some of those people never read Rousseau or Locke or Montesquieu or, I don't know, any, I would say, liberal thinker or liberal philosopher. They don't know about that. Some of them are completely illiterate. Remember the poor man who set himself into fire, in Tunisia. And I think that's basically because freedom is in the mind of anyone in the world. And I think that's one of the most important progresses of globalizations. And that's why we cannot have double standards. And that's also one of the difficulties you were mentioning, civil societies, and right. Because sometimes we have to protect the individual from the state's oppressions, from dictatorships. But sometimes we have also to protect the liberty of the people from the communities and from the society itself. And so we go back to Tocqueville, because that was also what Tocqueville was saying many times ago.
Let's see, why don't we take a question there and then one here in the middle of the room, and we'll take actually this one also.
Hi, Rich Kramer, Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you for a great conference so far, to the organizers and to this panel. An aspect of the report that I found particularly telling and wasn't that surprising to me, having worked in democracy assistance for 15 years now, was that there wasn't an inherent link between democratic governance and the firm maintenance of human security. So the question I have then is there a role for the democracy assistance community to try to help build a more inherent link between these two aspects, this aspect of governance and this aspect of people's realities? And I recognize to a certain degree that this could be very, very well problematic, one, because it's an ideological matter, the role of the state vis-a-vis its citizens, And then secondly, in many developing countries, the extent to which a state has the institutional capability or the financial ability to be able to provide for greater human security. It strikes me that if, to a certain degree, the democracy assistance community is able to help reconcile these two and demonstrate that democracies do perform better in respect to human security, that bolsters our ability to be able to help people realize the values that they have cherished universally. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. All right, here in the third row and then the fifth row.
Thank you. My name is Roman Shuto. I'm from Kiev Detector Media think tank. Thank you for brilliant speeches. My question will be about freedom of speech. Because this is a feature of the information age, that information can be not only good but also a source of threats, and it can be weaponized and kill people. And we know pretty well how it's hard to ensure security and to save the freedom of speech, not to cross this red line where we start limiting this freedom. And in Ukraine, we know it especially well. So how do you think tomorrow, having all these hybrid clashes behind, what will happen with freedom of speech? Will it be the same, or will it come to some kind of limitation of this freedom in the name of security? Thank you.
Thank you. And why don't you pass it back to the gentleman behind you? And then we'll start with Chris Walker and answer any of the three questions you hear before we turn it back over to Ted. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Dario Cristiani. I teach at Vesalius College in Brussels. I have a question for Mr. Joma and one smaller for Mr. Joma and Ms. Lexman. I actually live in Tunis at the moment. And when President Essebsi released this speech about these new rights for women, I do agree that the role of women in public space is essential for democratization, but many in Tunis, after that speech, thought that that speech came to cover the impact of the economic reconciliation law and of this Blue Dragon scandal, etc. If we see also what's going on now in Saudi Arabia with the easing of certain restrictions for women in the public space as liberal measure to show that the new leadership is more enlightened than the one in the past, and it seems that it's a way to cover other issues happening, because there is this perception in the Middle East and North Africa that women's rights is something that governments can use towards European and Americans to say, look, we are doing what you want, and then we do other things like hiding ourselves. I want to ask you, do you think there is this risk that this improvement of the condition of women in the public space can be used as a way to cover the return of certain practices or certain issues? And then, talking about the clash between interests and values, I would say that the Euro-Mediterranean partnership or the Barcelona process was very much like an example of this clash. The rhetoric, the liberal rhetoric of the EU clash with the actual actions, for instance, in Tunisia, but also in many other countries. Now, after the Arab Spring, I want to ask you, to Mr. Joma and Ms. Lexman, whether you have seen an actual change in the role of the EU as an actor in democracy promotion, or the EU has maintained this inconsistency between the rhetoric, the liberal rhetoric, and the more, I would say, realist-oriented action. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we start with Chris and we'll work our way down.
Sure, maybe I'll address the free speech question. I think this issue is if it's not at the top of the list of challenges facing democracy, it's close to it. It's a global issue. And I would put it this way. I think the changes in the media sector and in the information space, they've been a long time in the making, but the impact of, say, the rise of social media, the erosion of traditional media, the way in which news and information reaches ordinary citizens, the way in which it can be manipulated, both by the corporations who have editorial responsibility for the content coming out and from hostile actors, both non-state and state, are mind-boggling. And I think the efforts to deal with the manipulation question, the disinformation, propaganda questions, that are happening in this region to the immediate west of Russia are as important as anywhere, because they're in the crucible, they're the ones who have the historical understanding, who have the initiatives on the ground that are learning about these things and how to address them. But this is just one part of the question. And I think what you were suggesting in your question may be the toughest part of it. It's how democracies stay true to their own values while they wrestle with what often can be hostile information, implanted information that we're already seeing in a number of different settings. And I don't think we have the answer for that yet, but it's something that we need to devote serious attention to in the coming period.
Thank you. Nicholas?
Well, I think I will address very quickly two issues. Sorry, thank you. The first one is about, I would say, what you were saying about realism. And I think that the claim for human rights is basically realism. We must not oppose realism and the fight for human rights, because in the long run, in fact, if we continue to witness this crackdown on human rights, democratic values, and this, I will say, offense to liberal principles coming from our enemies, then what will remain for any realistic perspective? Because realism is all about taking the threat seriously and about defining our own national interest. So I think that the question of the opposition between realism, because myself, when I'm claiming for human rights, quite often people say, well, you are a pure idealist. And I say, no, I'm basically a realist because I'm considering the threat. And I think that's part, of course, of the narrative we have actually to impose. And then coming back to the question of freedom, that's my second point very quickly. I think that we have to not to give in our basic principles, because otherwise we've lost the war again. We cannot discredit the principles of the democracies. But having said that, it's a sort of commitment to be more engaged in the fights, not only against disinformation, cyber attack, and this sort of things, but also to create our own narrative to make our societies and democratic and human rights value more attractive. That's also about rhetoric. And that's why we have also to debunk and to dismantle the speech of our adversaries, for instance, coming from Russia, talking about humiliations, about relativism, about, you know, the traditional values of Russian society or any other society. That's also part of our fight. And that's the fight also for freedom, but also in society where the freedom of speech, including for our enemies, is a key value for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you very much. I will also, a couple of thoughts within which I will answer those questions. I think the primary question is that, or the task for the Western democracies, who should be the beacon of the liberal democratic values, is that we need to bring back content to the values, the words which define our values. And I think this is often missing. And this will prevent also double standards in our democracy support elsewhere, but also it will strengthen our own democratic structures. I will very briefly say one story. A friend of mine who is a journalist and lives in Brussels and was looking into the life stories of those who committed attacks at the airport and the metro stations in Brussels. Their stories are this: these people have been born in a community. I mean, they were second generation of immigrants. They were born in Belgium. They grew up in Belgium. They went to school in Belgium, and they finished their education. They were under unemployment benefits. They sat home. They had their computer. They had the roof above their heads. They had food, but they had no community to support them. They were lonely. They didn't have classmates helping them to find a job. And this is this is the solidarity of Western democracies today. The heart is missing. There is money, there is support, but there is no heart. And that's the part which needs to be brought back to the words. And this is not where the state can supplement the civil society. This is precisely what should be the role of a civil society, but a genuine civil society. Another problem in our societies are the strong divisions, where we see that different parts of society see the same values, which have the same word, differently. But because of the way how our social communication now works, the algorithms of the social media, but also the algorithms, I would say, the live algorithm of our communities, is that we practically talk only to people who are ideologically similar to our views. This is not helping to have the values really in our daily practices, and not helping to kind of communicate and put the values in a forefront of our actions, because we do not know any longer what the values actually mean. And on the question on disinformation and freedom of speech, I do believe that freedom of speech has to be defended with any means. I mean, we cannot make steps forward or create any arbitrators of truth in terms of state or civil society, because this will not go, I mean, this is a slippery slope. On the other hand, we have to be very clear that the freedom of speech is an individual right, is an individual right of a human being. So we have to fight against bots, because they are not human beings, and they are disturbing the freedom of speech, because we consider them on social media as human beings. So first of all, we need to define between these two, and also we need to define between state actors who act as individuals in our discussions and discourses. And I think this has been also very clear. And we have to find legal means how to protect freedom of speech of individuals against this freedom of speech of artificial human beings or states which are pretending to be human beings in our discourses. And on women's rights, just a last comment. I mean, I don't want to comment on the U.S. I mean, it's a big question about U.S. democracy support. But where I would see is, yes, it's true, and this has been used by any governments, by any regimes, by any I don't know, hybrid regimes or actors, that they are pretending to improve the situation in order to gain something internationally, or veil their own mistakes or their own interests. But what the community of democracy is doing, and I think this is right, is to, I mean, we need to be very firm that we see this. I mean, we see these double standards, or we see these games being played around us, and that has to be clear, that we have to be clear. We have to say, okay, we appreciate you gave more rights to women, but there are other issues we need to discuss. This is step number one. Step number two is we have to use these new rights the women have gained, because if they will fail in using their rights, this will again turn against us. And this is precisely the role of the democracy communities, where we can help the women to be enjoying and using their rights, and thus supporting the civil society and communities in their countries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, to answer your question, you are right. Often politicians use rhetoric to make diversion when they have some troubles. In the case of Tunisia, I will distinguish the two topics, the women's rights and then the democracy. I think for the women's rights, it's a fundamental trend that we started a long time ago. And I think the first immunity I have against that is the education. And when I said that 2/3 of the students are women, I think it's a warranty, a sort of warranty. It does not mean that there is no issues. There is a lot of issues and a lot of work to do again, to go ahead in the equality between genders. For the democracy, I will be open and straight with you. You know, we thought, all of us, that because we have a secular, nice constitution, and because we succeeded to organize fair elections, we succeeded democracy. No, It's a starting. It's not enough. And we see it. We are living it today. We have to transform that into first institutions and to establish institutions with a good practice. I think the transition will take a long time, longer than what we imagine, because it's a mentality to change. And we see today that in the practice of that, even though we have a nice text, it's not yet compliant with the text, and there is some deviation, and we have to pay attention to that. Beside the institution, we have to set up some instances, control instances, to be sure that which is instances, and civil society has to do the work to be sure that we are really in the frame of the law and there is no deviation. So in the practice, I think that we will spend more time to transform it in a real democracy, and we see it even in the mature democracy. The work is a continuous work. Just one remark before we close is that for me, the democracy and through the Tunisian experience, it will be really successful if when we start to give the dividend to the citizen. Because the democracy today, it should be inclusive, and each citizen should find his interest. If I take the case of Tunisia today, with the stress, the economic trouble that we have, and the crisis we have, and with the social, people are asking themselves whether it's better today or before. We succeeded to face the terrorism and security challenges. Today, we have as well to consolidate this democracy by the success in economic transformation, in economic reforms, to give the dividends to the citizen, because the real democracy is the one who gives the rights, the freedom, but as well the dignity. And when I speak about dignity, it's a lot of things. It's education, it's health, it's security, but it's perspective and hope. So we are on the path. I think that it's not a short-term challenge. We're still confident on that, but we have to pay attention. And we know that democracy, even in the mature country, is never granted. We have a lot of challenges, but I think we feel confident that we will face that.
Okay, I'm actually receiving the signal that we have run over time. I apologize. I just want to say thank you to the organizers of this conference for including the discussion of democracy, values, and security. As we look at some of the other harder aspects of security, this is an important thing to keep in mind. I apologize, Ted, we're not able to have wrap-up comments by you, but I do hope you will speak with Ted and the panelists. We've distributed copies of the report through the room. And let me just say thank you to the panel and ask for a round of applause for Mr. Picone and for our panelists, please.
Thank you, Tom, and let me add that we would love to have this debate every year, and we will continue to invite you. I think this is critical, and I truly believe it will become more critical as we start to understand we cannot take it for granted democracy, human rights, and rule of law, as we have been taking for granted for many, many years. So I think this might actually at some point be the very core of the debate about security. Let's hope for that, but surely we will continue our cooperation here at the